We continue now at the top of Daf Samach Beis and Meseches Bava Basra. This is Bava Basra Daf 62b. This daf is sponsored by David Grossman. Thank you for your sponsorship. If you would like to sponsor in Amud or Daf, see the description box below to see how you can support this channel. The Gemara is asking, what if a seller says to a buyer, when he's selling a piece of property to the buyer, he says, B'seirugin mahu. What if he does it in a situation where it's alternating? The Rashbam explains, B'seirugin mahu. Kagon, for example, as follows. Let's say this piece of property that the seller is selling to the buyer, it's surrounded by 8 different people, 8 different properties, Shnayim l'chol ruach, and there are 2 properties on every side. Ruvain v'Shimon min ha-Mizrach, Levi v'Yehuda min ha-Tzafon, Yisachar u'Zvulun min ha-Ma'ariv, Yosef u'Vinyamin min ha-Adoram. You have Ruvain and Shimon on the east side of this property, Levi, Yehuda on the north, Yisachar and Zvulun on the west, Yosef and Binyamin on the south. V'chasav, and the way that the seller writes up the shtar is as follows. He says, Ruvain Meitzar Mizrach. Ruvain is going to be your eastern boundary of the property I'm selling to you. Levi Meitzar Safon. Levi is going to be the northern boundary. Yisachar Meitzar Ma'ariv. Yisachar is going to be the western boundary. Yosef Meitzar Doram. Yosef will be the southern. In other words, he only includes one of the properties on each side, even though there are 2 properties on each side. And so the Rashbam explains, if you're going to say that if he delineates it like gam, like the letter gam, which again is just like 2 sides of each corner, so if you're going to say that he's only going to get that diagonal, he's not going to get all the property, that's because that was a normal thing to do, to sell one row that's between 2 fields. It's not normal to sell every other plot, meaning in this particular diagram, every other triangle. That wouldn't be normal. So it makes sense to say that he just didn't want to write the name of every property. So he just skipped every other one. That way he'll indicate a boundary on each of the 4 sides. O Dilma, or maybe maybe he really did only sell alternating triangles. Again, he would have sold, let's say, this triangle by Ruvain, skip Shimon, then he sells the Levi one, skip Yehuda, etc. That's the question of the Gemara. The Gemara says Teku. The Gemara leaves it as a question. And the Gemara continues, Meitzar lo, Meitzar rishon, Meitzar sheni, Meitzar shlishi. Let's say when he's delineating the boundaries of the property that he's selling to the buyer, he mentions the boundary on the first side, the second side, and the third side. Meitzar revi, lo, Meitzar lo. But he does not mention the boundary on the 4th side. What would be the halach in that case? And so on that we have a machlokas amoraim. Amar Rav says, Kona hakol, he's going to acquire all of the property, chutz mi meitzar revi, except for that boundary line by the 4th side. The Rashbam says, Kona hakol, kol ma shemuvla, besoch gimel hametzarim, everything that's within the 3 boundaries, chutz mi meitzar dalid means hatelem atzmo shel meitzar revi, just that one row that's along the 4th boundary, lo kona, that he won't get, to lahachi ahani mai de lo kasam meitzar revi, since he didn't write the 4th boundary, he was just excluding basically the smallest amount possible. That's the opinion of Rav. Shmuel Amar, and Shmuel says, Afilu Meitzar Revi. Shmuel says that he gets, even the Meitzar Revi, he gets the entire thing. He didn't leave out anything. The Rashbam says, Afilu Meitzar Revi, Dahai Delo Kasve Mishum Delo Tzarach. He didn't write it because it's not something that is necessary to write. And so therefore, according to Shmuel, you get basically everything. Ravasi Amar, Ravasi says, Lo Kona Ela Telem Echad Al Pnei Kula. Actually, Ravasi says, when he left off Meitzar Revi, it's the most limiting. Ravasi says he's going to get only one row along the entire 3 boundaries which were mentioned, and he's not going to get anything else. And the Rashbam says, Telemechad al pnei kula etzel gimel hametzarim kamin ches. He's essentially going to get like the shape of a ches. Essentially, he would get one row along this side over here, one row over here, one row over here. That's all he would get. According to Ravasi, the fact that he didn't mention Meitzar Revi means I'm mentioning the 3 sides because you're only getting one row on each of the 3 sides. And the Gemara continues and explains Ravasi, Savar lo karav. Ravasi fundamentally holds like Rav, Diamar shiure shayir. Just like Rav says something is left off, from the fact that you're not mentioning the Meitzar Revi shows that something is left off, but Ravasi just takes it a step further. The shayir b'meitzer, shayir nami b'kuli. From the fact you left off that last boundary, he's really leaving off in the entire thing. That's why, again, he only gets one row along the 3 sides. The Rashbam says, Savar lo Ravasi karav. Ravasi holds like Rav. The reason why he didn't write it is because he is leaving something off. V'yadiva de Ravasi mi de Rav. And Ravasi goes even further than Rav. To Kasavar Ravasi, because Ravasi holds me the Shairei lemeitzer, from the fact that he left off that 4th boundary line. Shairei nami lekulo sada. He's really taking off from the entire field. Shekeneged hameitzer, that's opposite that boundary. Umiyo ahani gimel mitzarim. But nevertheless, the fact that he mentioned 3 of the boundary lines, that does help. Shekasav liknos por versa. He's going to acquire, the buyer is going to acquire something. He's going to get that one row along all of those three boundaries. And the Gemara continues, Amar Rava says, Hilchas of the halacha is that in this case where the seller mentions three of the boundary lines and not the fourth, the halacha is Kona hakol chutz mimeitzer revi. He's going to get everything except for that fourth boundary line, meaning except for the row by the fourth boundary. And that essentially is paskening like Rav. That's what Rav said, Kona hakol chutz mimeitzer revi, same idea. However, he says, V'lo amram, but that's only true ela de lo mivla, if it's not absorbed within it. Avol mivla, but let's say it's absorbed within it. We'll see the Rashbam in a moment. So then Kana, then he will get that fourth, the row along the fourth boundary line as well. And the Rashbam explains, V'lo amran de lo kana meitzer revi, we only say that he doesn't get that row by the fourth boundary, ela de lo mivla besoch shnei hamitzarim. That's only if it is not within the two sides, shemikana mikana, both sides. Ela holech al pnei shneim kazeh. That's if it's going essentially on the face of both of them in the following fashion. This would be the case of lo muvla. In a case where that row is lo muvla, it's not between these two lines, but it's above these two lines, so then he's not going to get it. Avol muvla, but let's say it is muvla. Let's say it's between the two of those three, the two parallel boundary lines which he mentioned. If that row is between them, as the Rashbam continues, Avol muvla kazeh kone kol mashiesh besoch hamitzarim. If it's muvla, like in this formation, he actually is going to get that row as well. And the Gemara continues, v'chi lo mivla nami, and also in the case where it's not included within the two boundary lines, in which case we say that he will not acquire that row. Lo amron el di'iko le richva dedikla. That's only true that he does not acquire that row if there's no row of trees over there, v'havetishas kabin, and it's able to produce 9 kav. Avoleko le richva dedikla, but let's say there is no row of trees, v'lo havetishas kabin, it's not able to produce from 9 kav, so then actually he would acquire it even though it's not included within the two boundary lines. We'll see the Rashbam in a moment on that. And the Gemara continues, Mechlal, now according to that it implies, Muvla, that let's say that row is included within the two boundary lines, Afagav de'iko le richva dedikla, even though there is a row of trees, v'havetishas kabin, and it is 9 kav, Kana, he is still going to acquire it, because again it's Muvla, in that case it's included between the two boundary lines. And the Rashbam explains, this line over here in the Gemara is going on what Rava said. Rava again said that he's not going to acquire that fourth boundary, that row on the fourth boundary line. We say he doesn't acquire it specifically when that row is not included between the two boundary lines that were mentioned. And so now the Gemara is saying, in the case where it's not included between the boundary lines, where we said he does not acquire that row, that's only true that he does not acquire it if you have a bunch of trees that are planted there. That particular boundary line, that particular row, is large enough that you can plant 9 kav of seed, which is the shear of a field, the paragrishon that's mentioned in the first parak. And the point over here is, if it has this row of trees, or it can take 9 kav of seeds, that's considered an important piece of land on its own. So then we can assume that the seller kept it for himself. The Kadaya Gemara, and the Gemara is then inferring from that, Mechlal divrei de Rava anu lemedim, from the words of Rava we learn, what he's essentially saying is that when we're excluding this row, it has to have 2 negatives to say that we exclude it from the sale. Meaning, b'delo muvla, it has to be not included in the lines, and also it has to be that you have something chashuv over there, you have a row of trees, etc. Mechlal, that would imply de'i muvla, let's say it is included between the two boundaries that were mentioned. Afagav de'iko le richva dedikli, even though it is chashuv, it has a row of trees, it would still be that the buyer acquires it. Because then you only have 1 negative saying that the buyer should not, and therefore the buyer does indeed acquire it in that case as well. And the Gemara continues, Zika Diamri, there are those that say a slightly different version of the above Gemara. Amar Rava says, Hilchasa Kana Hakol. In this version, Rava says, the halach is that the buyer does get everything. Ve'afilu Meitza Revi, he even gets that fourth row by the fourth boundary that wasn't mentioned. And then we qualify as follows, V'lo Amranel Demivla, that's only true if it's included between the two lines. Avalo Mivla, but if it's not included between the two lines, Lo Kani, so then the buyer won't get that row. V'chi Mivla Nami Lo Amran, and even if it is included between the two lines, we we only say that if it's included, he's going to acquire it. Ela deleko le richva dedikla, if there's no row of trees. V'lo havetishas kabin, it's not choshev enough. It's not large enough to plant 9 kav. Avaliko le richva dedikla, but let's say it does have a row of trees. V'havetishas kabin, or it's large enough to plant 9 kav of seeds. Lo kana, so then again it's considered choshev on its own, and the buyer will not acquire it. And in this version, the Gemara says mechlal, that would imply the chilo muvla, that in a situation where it's not between the 2 rows, afagav deleko le richva dedikla, even though there is no row of trees, v'lo havetishas kabin, and it's not able to take 9 kav of seeds, but since it's not between the two boundary lines, lo kani, the buyer will not acquire. And the Gemara says, Shaminan mitarvayu lishni de Rava, we see from both the versions of Rava, de visada lo shayr v'lo midi, that when it comes to the field, meaning besides for that last row by the 4th boundary, in terms of the rest of the field, he hasn't left anything off, the buyer certainly will acquire the field. The only question is, in terms of that row along the 4th boundary that wasn't mentioned. And the Gemara continues, V'shamina nami, and we also understand from this, Dehecha demivla, v'leko le richva dedikla v'lo havet tishas kabin, kana, in a situation where it is included between the lines, and it doesn't have the row of trees, and it's not able to take 9 kav of seeds, so then certainly kana, then certainly the buyer will acquire it. There's no reason not. Lo mivla, now let's say it's a situation where it's not included between the lines, v'iko le richva dedikla v'havet teskabin, and it does have a row of trees, and it is able to take 9 kav of seed, lo kana, so then certainly he will not acquire, the buyer won't get it. And finally the Gemara says, mivla, if it's between the lines, v'iko le, and it does have the row of trees, or it does have the 9 kav, it is considered chashiv. Or lo mivla, let's say it's not between the lines, v'leko le, but it does not have enough to be considered chashiv, important on its own. So then itmar lo lahai gisa, v'itmar lo lahai gisa, then it's going to essentially be a machlokas between the 2 versions above, whether or not the buyer acquires that row or not. And the Gemara ultimately says in that case, shuda dedaini, we will leave it to the discretion of the judges. And the Rashbam explains, going in the second version, V'hachi Perusha, this is the explanation of the second version, Mida ukma Rava lahai va'afilu meitzer avi, from the fact that Rava says that when it comes to the row by the 4th boundary line, betarti lativusa, that you have to have 2 to the buyer's benefit, meaning to say, bidemivla, number 1, it has to be between the lines, v'leko aleh, and also there has to be that it's not considered chashav, it's not considered to be important on its own, and only then the buyer acquires it. Mechlal, that would imply, de'ilom mivla, let's say it's not between the lines, afagav deleko, even though again it's not considered to be important, lo kana, in those cases you're not going to acquire, he's not going to acquire it, because again you have to have both factors in order for the buyer to be able to acquire it. It has to be between the lines, and also it has to be not considered a chashav piece of land on its own. Misham deika chadal reyus, if you have just one negative, so then according to the second version the buyer is not going to get that row. And the Gemara then says, "V'kapasuk Gemara." The Gemara then paskins v'shamin and mehani trei lishni derava. When you take these 2 versions into account in terms of determining the final halacha, we understand the afagav de pligi kedel kamon bahachi. Even though there's a machlokas here that they are arguing about something, miolo pligi. Nevertheless, they're not arguing on everything. V'chein halacha, and the halacha is as follows: de ba'ara lo shayir ela b'meitzer revi. When it comes to the land, so you're not going to leave off except in that 4th boundary line, that row. Dehainu karav, meaning everyone agrees fundamentally with what Rav said, that the only thing that might be left off is that row by the 4th boundary line. And in a situation where, let's say, it's between the lines and it's not considered chashav on its own, so certainly the buyer will acquire it. Then you have 2 to the buyer's benefit. And let's say you have a situation where you have 2 negatives, so then lo kana, so then the buyer's not going to acquire. That's going to be 2 against the buyer. Now mivla, let's say it's between the lines, which is good for the buyer. However, it's considered chashav on its own. Or the other way, inami lo mivla, or let's say it's not between the lines. However, it's not considered chashav on its own. Dahainu chadal letivusa v'chadal reyusa. That's a situation where it's 1 to the buyer's benefit, but 1 against the buyer. So amri la betrei lishni. So then you have a situation over here that's a machlokas between the 2 versions. The aliba de Rava lishna kamakana. According to the first version of Rava, we're going to say the buyer gets that row. Lishna Basra lokana, and according to the second version, we're going to say the buyer does not get it. The kapasuk Gemara, and the Gemara ultimately paskins shuda dedaini, we leave it to the discretion of the judges. Hashloches hadayonin me'achar de mesafkalan, since we don't really know navid shuda, so we have to leave it to the discretion. Hakol afiyo inyan sheyiru hadayonim, whatever the judges feel is appropriate. V'yakiru hamocher eino yafa, they have to decide, is the seller somebody who's generous or is he somebody that's not generous? Hakol afiyo medaitam, everything goes according to what they evaluate. And the Rashbam continues, Umir, nevertheless, B'shar Mekomos to Mesafkol and B'trei Lishni, Hilchas HaKaman. Now, in other situations, where let's say you have two versions and you don't know which one to paskin like, Lo Amrinan Shuda Dedaini, we don't just say Shuda Dedaini, Ad Sheyefaresh Ki Hachel HaMotzim Echaver Olavaraya. Unless the Gemara tells you that we say Shuda Dedaini, the assumption is that we actually apply the rule of Hamotzim Echaver Olavaraya, which means that wherever the property is, wherever the money is, it should stay in that possession unless you prove otherwise. That's what we would generally paskin in these kinds of cases, unless the Gemara says otherwise, like over here, where the Gemara says Shuda Dedaini. And the Gemara continues at the two dots. Amar Rabba says, Palga de Isli Biara. Let's say a person is a partner in a field, and he's selling, and he says, the half that I have in this land, that's what I'm selling to you. So then Palga, then what he means to say is, we assume he means to say that he's selling his entire share, meaning half of the land, half of the field. Palga Biara de Isli. Now let's say the way he phrases it is, half among the land that I have. Now he owns half the land, and he's giving you half of that. So then Riva, so then we say that he's just selling a quarter. Amar le Abaya said to Rabba, Maishnahachi, what's really the difference? It seems like very similar language. Why do you make this distinction? And the Gemara says Ishtik, the Gemara says Rabba was silent. Amar Abaya says, Anos Savri, so I thought, me the Ishtik, from the fact that he was silent, Kibule Kible, that he accepted my argument, and there's no difference in the language. But he said, Velo'i, it's not really true, because Chazina Hanushtari, the Nafkimi Beimar, I saw some documents that came out of the house of the master, out of Rabba's house, Uchsibhu Hachi, and is written over there like this, Palga di Isli Ba'ara, if he says half that I have of the land, Palga, so then it's going to be half. It means half, like we said above, Palga Bi'ara di Isli, but half of the land of which I have, meaning to say half of what I actually have, which is half of half, then Riva, then it means a quarter, so I see that he did not retract based on my argument. And the Gemara continues, V'yama Rabba, and Rabba says, Meitzar arad mina palga. If the way that it's phrased is, the boundary of the land from it is half, so then palga. Then he's selling him half of the land. We'll take a look at the Rashbam in a moment. But Meitzar arad mina psika, but if he says he's cutting off some from the boundary of the land, then tes kav, and then all he's retaining for himself is 9 kav, meaning the amount of field that you can plant 9 kav of seed. Amar le Abaya said to him, he said to Rabba, Maishnahachi, what's really the difference between these two languages? Ishtik, he was silent. So Savar Mino, he thought that from the fact that he was silent, Idi v'idi palga, that in both cases it's going to be half. And we'll take a look at the Rashbam. The Rashbam explains, Meitzer arad demina palga. Palga means as follows. Ruvain shayelo sado machar miksaso l'Shimon. Ruvain, he has a field, he's selling part of it to Shimon. Letzad Ma'ariv, he's selling the western part of the field to Shimon. Umitzad Mizrach ikev liatzma, on the eastern side of the field, something he's leaving for himself. V'lo pirish kama machar v'kama shar liatzma, but he's not clear how much is he selling and how much is he keeping for himself. Elakach kasav, he just writes as follows: Hamitzorim sadeploni shani mocher leploni mitzad Ma'ariv Levi. He says on the western side, the boundary that I'm selling, that's where Levi's field is, that's where the boundary line is. Umitzad Mizrach arad mina palga, and then on the eastern side, the land from it half. So what does that mean? It means hakarka atzma shehi shali shachaluka mimena, the part of the land that's going to be mine, that's going to be divided off. Zusha macharti hu meitzer mizrachi shala. That's the part on the eastern side. Palga half. Means to say palga machar lo, means to say he's really just selling him half the field. Essentially what he's really selling is he's selling the western half of the field, and the eastern half of the field he's keeping for himself. Ta'kamar de mina palga, that's what it means when he says mina palga de mashma chaluka lechatzoy, and it means to say divided in half. But if the way he phrases it is de mina psika, so that's mashma sada haruya lifsok mikarka acheres. That means like a field that can be independent, can be its own field. That's how much he's retaining for himself. And that would be at the very least 9 kav, meaning enough to plant 9 kav of seed, like we learned in the Mishnah in the first parak, and we will continue with this discussion in the next video on Daf Samech Gimel Amud Aleph.